Red Bull was flying high in the early part of the 2010 F1 season, with drivers Mark Webber and Sebastian Vettel tied at the top of the standings, having won 3 of the opening 6 races. Another win seemed to be on the cards as they ran first and second in the Turkish Grand Prix, but instead we got the first major flashpoint between 2 drivers who would continue to have a strained relationship during their time in the same garage, as they collided while battling for the lead at Istanbul Park, handing a 1-2 to the chasing McLarens. Red Bull then seemed to make the situation worse by handling the fallout really badly, while McLaren had their own misunderstanding to fix after the race as well, as their cars nearly collided while battling for the lead a few laps later. Welcome to Back V10s' latest detour into the V8 era, as we look back on everything that was going on around the 2010 Turkish Grand Prix. And joining me, Glenn Freeman, to do that are 2 men who were there that weekend. It's always fun when we get to do this with people who are on site. So we've got Ed Straw and John Noble. John, I'll come to you first for the typical opening question. Turkey 2010, frighteningly long time ago now, but when you think back to that weekend, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, the collision between Seb Vettel and Webber still stands out, an iconic F1 moment. But also with this V10 thing, I always like going back through my hard drive photos at home just to see what happened this weekend, because sometimes you do so many races and you can't remember various moments. And quite a fun one, that one of the best photos of Turkey 2010 was Ed Straw climbing out of a hire car on a ferry, trying to get from the passenger side out through the driver's side because there wasn't a big enough gap for him to climb out the car.
It's a very well liveried hire car as well, wasn't it? Which I didn't remember.
Well liveried? What was the livery?
The big Hertz livery on it.
Oh, amazing.
It's very strange.
Ed, other than clambering out of a car on a ferry, what stands out for you for that weekend?
Well, something that's often referred to privately is about the other person in this room who was in Turkey in 2010, in producer Johnny.
What's this going to be?
Who was there for F1 racing. So we were, if memory serves, all travelling together. I believe you were on that same ferry. But we popped into this little small shop to get some supplies, me, John Noble, Johnny Reynolds, and we've got the bag of supplies, and the guy put it all in the bag and it was paid for. And there was just this fantastic moment where he had the bag and he's having to work out who to give it to. So he looks at John Noble, looked at me, and then straight away looked at little Johnny Reynolds and just gave him the bag. And we decided that was the moment that he decided Johnny Reynolds was the serf who had to do all the fetching and the carrying, which actually did accurately portray the status. So he was our serf for that particular Turkish Grand Prix, and that's always stuck in mind for some reason.
I did not see that coming. This has been already one of the best openings to a show, with apologies to producer Johnny.
No apologies.
Well, I was going to say, he's kind of still in that role now, isn't he?
He is the podcast serf.
Yeah. It makes the rest of us look good. Let's get back on track. A big talking point going into the Turkey weekend then was the news that Sebastian Vettel was getting a new chassis from Red Bull off the back of him being outpaced by teammate Mark Webber at the previous 2 races. Vettel admitted he'd been complaining that something wasn't right with his car, so he felt it was good that Red Bull were making the change, and he reckoned it would explain a lot. He accepted it didn't mean he would suddenly arrive in Turkey and everything would be fine, but he was hopeful the change would make him happier in the car. And after first practice on Friday, he said that the new chassis felt more natural to drive, so he was very happy with the change. However, Webber said years later in his book that Red Bull management had decided to tell Vettel his old chassis was cracked, even though it wasn't. Webber said that team boss Christian Horner allowed Helmut Marko to deliver the news to Vettel to help him rationalise the fact he'd just been well and truly beaten by the old Aussie in the other car. Webber said that in Vettel's mind, it was beyond comprehension that I could beat him fair and square. There had to be another reason why. And he said that Red Bull's decision to boost Vettel's confidence in this way said a lot about what was going on at the heart of the team. John, what do you think of that? If Vettel's original chassis was fine, is it still kind of okay for Red Bull to let him think there was a problem if they think that's going to kind of fix his head?
Yeah, but you have to put this in the context of that Red Bull wasn't necessarily a divided team, but there were definitely factions. Well, I mean, Turkey blew it into the open, but the factions and the Team Vettel camp and Team Webber camp were clearly inside that team. And off the back of Mark's victories, it was clear that whoever was on Team Vettel wasn't happy and needed to justify things and push things on. And I think with chassis changes, often a lot of it is to do with the driver's head. We see this even up to F1 today. You'll see drivers complain about chassis. Teams will either tell them it's changed or will have found nothing wrong, and they'll say, oh, it feels completely different. So there was an element of that. So you can understand if you're Team Vettel and you're trying to explain things to him, keep him happy, push him on, put him into the right place, you will have done anything you can to have given Seb the kind of the benefit of the doubt and get him into a happy place, at least until qualifying when there was another problem.
And as a footnote, that chassis did return later in the season, and Webber used it, and I think he won in that car. So, okay, you can patch it up and make fixes, but just to underline the fact that it was the old psychological trick, it did later win race, but I don't think Vettel used it again. Now you could argue that was just giving the bad chassis to Webber, but I don't think it was about that. I was going to say it's the oldest trick in the book, but obviously chassis in that sense have only been around for a certain amount of time. But it's always that thing of people thinking there's something wrong with the car that they can't get to the bottom of is always there. There are times when there is something. I can think of times where there were bonding failures and that kind of thing that weren't picked up. But in this case, it was the psychological games.
And as you say, that still goes on today. And I think that's fine. If your driver's got into a kind of mental funk over something and you can at least give them that change and it makes them think there's been a reset, I think it makes sense. It's not the oldest trick in the book, but it's been around a long time. I'm sure Ross Brawn has told a story about either Ferrari or Mercedes did that to Michael Schumacher once, and they just changed the chassis plate. They didn't actually change the car. Anyway, we'll come back to Red Bull later. Someone who arrived in Turkey in really good form was Robert Kubica, who was off to a great start to life at Renault. He already had 2 podiums to his name from the first 6 races of the year. And in Monaco, he'd started on the front row and finished 3rd behind the 2 Red Bulls. Kubica warned people not to expect too much in Turkey, though, which he expected to be more like the Spanish Grand Prix, where he'd qualified 7th and finished 8th. He said it was important not to become over-optimistic because he felt it would be difficult to repeat the Monaco performance on a more conventional track. He also said that Renault had focused on maximising the strengths that it knew the car had during pre-season testing and that the team should be proud of the start it had made. But even so, he was surprised to have started the year that well, leaving him 6th in the championship at this point, ahead of Lewis Hamilton's McLaren, among others. Ed, what did you make of the way Kubica really just hit the ground running with Renault at the start of that 2010 season?
Yeah, there was a degree of surprise because you have to remember that team was in a bit of a mess because they'd had technical problems as well. They'd had wind tunnel trouble, so they'd rekitted their wind tunnel, etc. And then it'd been all the fallout from Singapore. Because
they're not really Renault anymore by this point, are they?
Exactly, yeah. So much has changed there. And I remember when Kubica signed there were other options. Williams was another good option as well. And you sort of thought, is that the right decision to make? And no, Kubica was absolutely on the money there. And he'd really made a strong impression there. And the team had kind of got itself onto an even keel right from the start in Bahrain, actually, where, if memory serves, I don't think he got a good result, but he qualified decently and could have qualified actually a little bit better. So even on their lesser tracks, the car was decent. And on places like Monaco and then later in the season, Suzuka, etc., it could be really, really mega. So, yeah, Kubica really showed what he could do there because he had that experience that he hadn't had when he'd come into BMW Sauber. And he was really at that point the Kubica who knew what he wanted and was really pushing his team in a way that would be really annoying if he wasn't so good. And it can be slightly annoying even when a driver's that good, and Kubica still does this to this day because he's the guy who will push on every single thing that he thinks, right, this is not right, this should be this way, why aren't we doing that, why aren't we doing that, why haven't you already done it? I'm going to keep saying it. That's just what you get with Kubica, and it's a great thing. It's what that team needed as well.
Well, let's talk about that a bit more because Kubica offered an insight himself into how pushy he'd been behind the scenes when he arrived at Renault. He said as soon as he joined, he could see things that could be improved, and he told the team straight away. He said Renault had responded well, even if on some issues the team maybe took a bit too long and didn't agree in the beginning, but the things he wanted to change were changed. He said the reason he'd been so forceful was because he knew it was important to move quickly in the right direction to be ready for the start of the season. And there were things that he suggested that the team wasn't used to doing that took a bit longer to convince them to do. Team boss Eric Boulier said Kubica had an excellent understanding with the team and that it was a pleasure to work with a driver who is as hungry for success as we are. Speaking about 2010 on F1's Beyond the Grid podcast, Kubica said that was his best 10 months of work in F1. John, we all know how fast Robert was, and as Ed kind of outlined there was always this really strong, steely, behind-the-scenes drive that he had that you maybe didn't always see in public. But do you think being that forceful and being a guy who can go in and say, you need to change this, this and this straight away, was that almost underestimated in all of the things that made Kubica such a great force at this point in F1?
Yeah, it's how a team views it, because you can be forceful and it can trigger pushback and why are we being told what to do by a driver who doesn't do anything? But equally, if the driver is as strong as Kubica was, pushed on, delivered the results, and even when he delivered wanted more and pushed on more, then I think that empowers him. And especially at a team like Renault in this period, post all the Singapore fallout, they'd lost Fernando, title sponsors had gone, all the chaos and worries about the future. So it needed kind of its belief back and a focal point and someone to push it on and focus on what can we do better rather than worrying about what's happened in the past and reflecting on failures and what's gone wrong and are we about to pull out of Formula One and it's all over for us. So, and I think Robert was very forceful. It caused, we know the problems it caused at BMW Sauber with Mario Tyson and pushing on. But I think it fitted in perfectly where Renault was at, how the team and Eric were taking those criticisms, where Kubica was in his career. And it's just a shame that I'd love to have seen where that would have gone on were it not for that rally crash.
And it's worth noting as well that the kind of Alonso return to that team had kind of trailed off a bit. I remember speaking to one relatively senior engineer at that team. He said they got a bit frustrated with Alonso at the back end of the year. So actually there's an extra effect because they had a slightly diminished Alonso who was a bit frustrated.
In 2009.
In 2009, yeah. And then they got Kubica in and they thought, well, let's see how good this guy is. And they realised not only is he mega, but also he is that sort of driving force. So they actually quite wanted that as well, even though there will have been times, knowing Kubica well, where they will have grumbled a bit and been a bit, he's a pain, but he's probably right because that's just the kind of character he is.
There was another significant piece of news for F1 ahead of the Turkish Grand Prix as Bernie Ecclestone announced that F1 will be going back to America in 2012 at a new track built in Austin, Texas, the track we now know as the Circuit of the Americas. This may be hard to believe for newer fans as we sit here with 3 US races on the modern calendar, but the addition of Austin would bring back the United States Grand Prix for the first time since 2007 when Indianapolis last hosted it. Bernie said this was a big deal because for the first time in the history of Formula One in the United States, a world-class facility will be purpose-built to host the event. I've been looking for the right place and I hope now that we have a permanent home. Now, both of you have been to the US Grand Prix at Austin countless times. Ed, is it fair to say that in this case, Austin delivered what Bernie was hoping for?
Well, to an extent, it was
I was expecting you to be a lot more emphatic than that.
Right from the start, it was a great event.
Right.
It really was a great event. Fantastic circuit. I remember being there at the first free practice session, which was freezing cold, and watching Kimi Räikkönen sort of wheel spinning, trying to get out the pit exit, which was obviously up a hill, and there was just no grip and everything. But great track to watch at, great event, and it got good attendances straight away. So it did give F1 a good proper facility in the US. But I wouldn't say the existence of that race in itself kind of opened the doors in the US or anything, because it's very easy to say that's the starting point for what we're seeing now. And I don't think it was actually, because even that event has gone from, decent crowds to just the crowds they get now are way bigger than they were in the 2010s. So it was a positive and it was a great event and it remains a great event. But I don't think it opened the door really to the US in a clear way. Everything didn't follow from that point. It was a nice event to have, good for the calendar, good to go to, but the limitations of the way F1 was run in the Bernie Ecclestone era meant that just doing that on its own was never going to be enough to really open the door in the US market. But it was nice to have a little foothold. That was quite important because you had all the Indy nonsense in 2005. So to have 7 years after a new event happening, because 2012 was the first one, wasn't it, I think? To have a new event that was successful and popular and well attended, that seemed pretty unlikely. So in that regard, it sort of restarted F1 in the US, but I don't think it delivered on everything Eccleston would have hoped for. But that doesn't mean it didn't deliver quite a bit.
Yeah, and I guess the big thing that I do see the logic of is a permanent, purpose-built place, because F1's existence in America up to that point had been nomadic in terms of circuits. You're bouncing between street circuits and then the Indy Road course. So at least it had a proper F1 track, to call it that, in the States.
And I would say that's the more race fans race in the US. Now, there's lots of different ways today to follow F1 and interact with F1. Some of it less related to what's going on track, which is all great, but COTA is the race of those three in the US. If you want to go to the racing purists, the fans race, they go and have a few beers watching trackside and just enjoy the event. That's what COTA is, and that's the role it still has to its day. So it's still a really important part of Formula One in that regard.
So F1 had an American race coming back, but it didn't have an American team, although it had come close for 2010 with the attempt by US F1 to join the grid. One of the people involved in the late rescue bid for US F1 that involved, do you remember this, YouTube co-founder Chad Hurley? When I was doing research, I totally forgot about this guy.
It was a huge deal when that was
announced. It was, yeah. So obviously there were still attempts to rescue the project, and one of the people who'd been working with Chad Hurley was now trying to find another way onto the grid. And by this point, it wasn't doing another US F1. It was trying to buy into a team, because the feeling was that actually starting from scratch was pretty much impossible. The person who was still cracking on with this was a guy called Paris Mullins, who, John, you interviewed for Autosport at the time. And Mullins said then, a competitive startup team simply isn't possible given the state of the sport and its rules. He said teams needed experience and knowledge from years of competing, and that taking over a team and making necessary changes was the way to go, citing Brawn taking over Honda, Red Bull taking over Jaguar, and then Minardi, Force India taking over Jordan Midland Spiker, that being the way to do it. He also said there were a great deal of people in the US who want to be involved in F1 because it had this global appeal. So even if the US market didn't yet understand F1 in the way that it does today, companies found it more appealing than domestic series like IndyCar or NASCAR because of that global reach. John, as I said, you did this interview at the time. Do you think he's been proved right by everything that's happened with F1's incredible growth in the US in the last decade?
Yeah, it's a bit like the Austin scenario that Ed mentioned. It's almost like chicken and egg, that would F1 have made the impact in America if Austin didn't exist? But would Austin have been successful if F1 hadn't made the impact in America? But I think in some respects it was about getting a foothold in the States, that you needed that starting point. It wasn't going to be successful by itself, and it relied on liberty. It relied on Netflix, the Drive to Survive, just lifting it all up and opening those horizons. And that's what got the ball rolling. But you can argue none of that would have happened if Austin hadn't been there in the first place. So I think in the end, that interest was there. And I think we're only just starting to tap into it. I know we've got 3 races, but you look at what Liberty and F1 are doing now with Apple TV, for example, trying to expand horizons. We know there's sponsorship interests in the States. You look at Otro Capital, for example. You look at where Christian Horner's been speaking to in terms of investors going forwards. It's America. Now you look at the Middle East was a focal point over the past 4 or 5 years. Maybe things are shifting now. Maybe America's a lot of untapped potential still there. So I think we're still only at the start of the journey in terms of America and F1. I can't imagine would go more than 3 races. I think that's already kind of close to saturation point for an F1 World Championship. But all those small shoots were there back in this era in terms of Austin, in terms of that team that never happened. But absolutely correct that you're creating a startup, especially in that era pre-cost cap, was never feasible, was never going to happen. And I think it's quite smart to realise that there was no way to do it, because it's very, very easy for CEOs of big companies to say, yeah, we can come in and we'll buy this and we'll be winning races in a couple of seasons and the championship in 5, when there was never, ever on the cards.
Let's talk about a couple of the brand new teams then that were finding life a struggle in F1 in 2010. And we'll start with Lotus, which was doing the best job, even if they were still cut adrift at the back with Virgin and HRT. Lotus boss Tony Fernandez said that his team was earning respect in the paddock from rival teams and that they now needed to earn the respect of fans and sponsors. But he felt the Lotus story had already moved on from people wondering if they would survive, and he wasn't taking any criticism or negativity around their performance seriously. However, he also felt that F1 needed to change, saying the costs needed to be addressed and that the sport should be simplified and made more fun. Although alongside that, he said it should move closer to the car industry to become a good provider of knowledge.
What's more fun than the car industry in
Well, I was
F1?
gonna say, you
Fans love
can't
that.
simplify it and make it car industry relevant. I think that's been F1's problem for about 30 years now. Ed, anyway, let's talk about Lotus, a backmarker team, a modern Ed's Sheds contender, you might say. Was Lotus getting much respect in the paddock at this stage of 2010? I guess purely from being the best of those new teams that were coming in and struggling so much.
Yeah, I think they were, because there was this little competition at the back with the three new teams. So there was a clear...
The Battle of Q1.
Exactly. So there's a clear class war to fight there, which was quite interesting. And they were decent. They looked the part. They'd come in and just been credible. They had good experienced drivers. So, yeah, they'd done a good job. And actually, that team had come together relatively late. I remember visiting their factory in Norfolk not that long before they started competing. It was basically empty, and wandering around it with Mike Gascoigne to do an Autosport feature. And they had a lot of work to do because I won't repeat all of the things that went on in terms of them getting the entry, but it wasn't straightforward. So, yeah, they'd come in, they'd been credible, and they were the team that people were saying, yeah, they look the part, obviously a long way off, but I think anybody who understands the complexities of starting a Grand Prix team would know that. Obviously, the downside is then when you get the owner saying, well, it needs to be simplified, made easier, cost cut, etc., etc. That shows that there was already the recognition that it was going to be very, very difficult to turn that team into one of the bigger teams. But at that point, the trajectory was very positive, and you'd say, yeah, they've done a decent job, and they are the best of the new teams.
Yeah, so that's the best of the new teams. Let's talk about the worst next, because HRT was in the news before Turkey as it had split with Dallara, which had designed and built the team's first car. In announcing the split, in quite a lengthy statement actually, the two sides said that they felt they had achieved more than could have been reasonably expected by just about getting the team's cars ready for that first weekend in Bahrain. However, the team's statement also said that no development work had been carried out on the car yet, and there were reports in the media that senior figures within HRT had been unimpressed with the build and design quality of the car. Test driver Christian Klein had said the car was not quite F1 standard, and HRT's technical consultant Jeff Willis said the level of engineering doesn't reflect current F1 practice by some margin, as the car was missing a lot of tricks that would be taken for granted by anyone in the pit lane today. John, was it probably for the best that we've got this team up and running? Maybe HRT and Dallara should go their separate ways.
Yeah, it was a relationship that wasn't working. I remember Colin Collis, who the team principal, who even in a friendly conversation would be quite angry about things. So there was a base level of anger.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to get that anger to an increased level, just talk about Dallara. So was very unhappy about what was kind of being provided and the level of quality expected. And I think Jeff Willis talked at the end of the year that believing that the step up from GP2 to F1 would be 30% was actually, you need to be 10 times better, more refined. It was the era where things had stepped up in F1, which cost a lot of money. And these teams, remember, had come into F1 and originally promised it'd be under a cost cap, and it wouldn't be limits on budgets. The cost cap never happened. Situations changed. Things got very expensive. And that relationship that potentially may have worked under a cost cap wasn't going to work in terms of the demands needed. So in the end, it was either going to head to a split or it was going to head to a court case. I think they were the only two outcomes.
The one thing we should add on that is that there were some fair criticisms of Dallara who weren't at F1 standard, because F1 standards even then were ludicrously high. They were still a good company though, and they had done development work, but obviously there were concerns about the quality of the work. So there was quite a big upgrade package but I don't think it was ever paid for.
Yeah.
And now it may come down to the fact that the team thought, well, we're not convinced this will deliver or whatever, but there was quite a substantial amount of performance that was never bolted onto the car. So they weren't just sitting on their hands doing nothing. So very slightly disingenuous to say there'd been no development work. But I think John's fundamentally right that where those two entities were at that point, probably it was better they went their separate ways.
Another team that was interested in joining the F1 grid around this time was junior racing powerhouse ART, run and co-owned by a certain Fred Vasseur, who we all know in F1 today as Ferrari F1 boss. Vasseur's co-owner, Nicolas Todt, son of ex-Ferrari boss and at this point FIA president Jean Todt, told Italian media that ART had expressed an interest in stepping up for 2011, but the plans were not certain yet. Todd called the F1 step logical for a team that had won a lot in F3 and GP2 by this stage, but he accepted that the step was gigantic, which is why ART never made a concrete declaration that they were going to enter F1. This was just an interest. He said they would only go into it if they knew it could be a long-term programme, and in the end they backed out a few weeks after this, citing unfavourable economic conditions. Ed, would you have liked to see ART step up from the junior ranks to a fully fledged F1 entry in 2011?
It would have been fun because they were a proper junior single-seater powerhouse over a very, very long period of time. I think the fact that they didn't tells you why it would have been so good if they could have done. Because, and this becomes a circular argument, but if they had gone ahead with it, it would have been because they had the resources and the chance to do it properly. So it was probably good they didn't, for good reasons, but if they had got to that point, because if Fred Vasseur and Todd looked at it and said, yeah, we can really do this, you can take that to the bank. I mean, still really difficult, but those individuals are people who don't take lightly that sort of challenge. So I think probably the best way to look at it is that was a team that should be, if things are working as they should and you have a connection between other single-seater category teams and F1 as they used to be, that's the obvious team to step up. The fact they couldn't tells you how big that chasm was, and that chasm's got ultimately bigger because you don't step up anymore. Even if an F2 team wanted to do F1, it would be effectively it's a startup team. So that tells you a lot about the situation, doesn't it? But it would have been nice, but just wasn't possible. It's probably very good they didn't go ahead, or they'd have probably lost a lot of money. Because that
out of business.
Exactly, because they'll have known how dangerous it would have been to do it. So, yeah, would have been good, but it would have been good because it would have worked. It didn't happen because it wouldn't have worked. So it was good it didn't work.
I mean, it would have been a massive throwback, wouldn't it, to kind of an era where we were at the start of the V10 era, when teams could go, right, we're an F3000 team, we're going to take on F1. The world had moved on by this point. I covered various championships that ART were often winning in the years leading up to this. And I remember, it must have been around this time, doing a thing with Fred where he explained why they weren't doing it. And I came away from that just going, the reason you're so good is because you've identified that you shouldn't go ahead with this. And I think it's great that he's ended up in F1, not with his own team, but is forging quite the career now as a team boss, because I think even back then he and Nicolas Todt showed that they could run a pretty slick operation, and I think that's why Fred is surviving in F1. But yeah, a shame really that just F1 had moved on from being able to do that sort of thing, I think. But let's get back to what was actually going on in F1 then, and a team that was a little disappointed with how they were getting on was Mercedes. This was the first year of the Silver Arrows being back on the grid, having bought Brawn over the winter. But Nico Rosberg said the team's struggles were difficult to explain. He said that although Mercedes was bringing a lot of developments and making some progress, he felt it was clear it wasn't enough progress. Mercedes motorsport boss Norbert Haug admitted he had hoped for more, and that Mercedes wanted to be winning, but it needed to be patient because all the ingredients are there. Haug said Mercedes was a good team that was composed and concentrated, but we need a lot more speed. John, do you think by this point it was starting to dawn on Mercedes that this F1 comeback wasn't going to be as straightforward as perhaps they were hoping when they bought Brawn off the back of Brawn winning a championship?
Yeah, it's easy to buy a team that's about to win the World Championship. I can't remember the exact timings of when it was all confirmed, but I'm not sure if they'd won the championship by then, but it was definitely the championship team. You were coming in, you had this dream with Silver Arrows are back. We can fight at the front. But the reality was Brawn was a team that had a very good car because it spent 12 months developing it, had then capitalised on a rules loophole at the start of the season to win the early races, managed to hang on by the skin of its teeth despite almost zero money, zero development, minimal upgrades, the absolute bare minimum. So partly naive to think that arriving into that team, throwing extra budget at it, development resources in that time frame was going to result in you returning to where you were at the start of the previous season. So I think it was a reality check for a team that needed to ramp up development, needed to ramp up its understanding of the cars, needed to ramp up aggression in terms of developments, it needs to ramp up how fast it was pushing things forwards. And I think that this was the reality of where they were. They weren't miles off. It wasn't a complete disaster, but it wasn't at the front of Formula One, and it was going to take a little bit longer for it to get there. And in the end, it took them until a rules reset came in to properly be there at the front.
And a lot more investment as well. It was, I think the phrase you always use, Ed, is, Mercedes thought they were getting a turnkey World Championship winning operation. But as you've outlined there, John, it wasn't quite like that. I always like to say that car wasn't the Mercedes W01. It was the Brawn BGP 002, really. A very underdeveloped car. Now let's move on to a surprise. What I found a really surprising piece of news during the Turkey weekend when I went back and researched this. And this was around F1's imminent deal that was about to be signed with Pirelli to take over from Bridgestone as F1's tyre supplier. But over the Turkey weekend, we learned that Michelin was making a last-minute bid to scupper the deal. Senior figures from Michelin arrived in Turkey for meetings with the F1 teams, with the talk being that Michelin would make an improved offer in the hope of becoming F1's next tyre supplier. Pirelli's offer was believed to be €500,000 cheaper per team than Michelin's, although McLaren's Martin Whitmarsh claimed that Michelin changed its offer at the last minute. Michelin later denied that was the case. Michelin said its late swoop to get back into F1 was simply a case of making sure teams had fully understood the details of our offer. It said it had values it wanted to respect, and that meant being able to demonstrate the technical capability of our product through open competition. It said that it felt its proposal was reasonable, and now it was up to the teams. Ed, we've had Pirelli ever since 2011. We've still got them today. Would you have liked to see Michelin come back into F1 in the 2010s?
I think generally Michelin is a bit of a gold standard as a tyre company in motorsport, isn't it?
It was a shame when they left.
Yeah, exactly. Pirelli does a lot. They come up with very good products, but Michelin does have that little bit of edge. I don't think it was quite what F1 was looking for, not least in terms of the wider commercial terms, because there's a lot going on in that Pirelli deal. So I think you would have never got Michelin to buy into some of the high deg stuff, and that was one of the talking points in terms of you want to try and control race like that. To be honest, F1 might have been better off without becoming obsessed with trying to engineer that, because it's really, really hard to do. And I think Michelin's always a positive, but it was quite a late thing that they were doing here. So it always seemed pretty unlikely given how advanced the Pirelli thing was, and there was there was trackside signage and all these deals are always way more complicated than just, we're going to supply your championship, because they've got deals with the teams, trackside advertising, all these things. What are you going to do to promote F1, etc.? What's it worth to the bottom line? That would have been an important thing. But yeah, it's an interesting fork in the road. But I suspect, again, it's a little bit like ART. I'm not sure they'd have delivered on what F1 felt they wanted at that
time. Did
F1
know they wanted that at this point? Because we're a couple of weeks before the Canadian Grand Prix, aren't we, where the tyres fall apart? Yeah,
well, obviously Michelin always wanted a very technically driven thing. I think there were ideas about what you wanted from a single tyre manufacturer, because they're still producing, trying to produce the target letters and that kind of thing that we talk about today. But yeah, it's true that Montreal was kind of the light bulb moment where you decided, this is exactly what we want. But the other problem is you would also want a tyre company that will commit to producing a product that does what you want for the amount of money. And I'm not sure exactly what the financials of the Michelin side would be, and obviously there was talk of revised offers, etc. But I know the Pirelli deal was very attractive commercially.
It was also the grass is always greener. F1's always thinking that we want something different to what we have now, because it will cure all our problems. Yeah. So tyres that degrade and fall apart will be a bigger challenge for drivers. We'll get offsets. It'll cause lots of overtaking and be spectacular. And it was when they did come in Pirelli, and we had, remember the start of 2012, all the different winners. It was all, oh, this is amazing. And then you realise actually it's quite difficult to manage high degradation races. Drivers don't like it. The complaints were coming. You need to rein back the degradation. And then ever since then, we've bounced between zero degradation, high degradation, zero degradation, high degradation. Just classic F1, not really knowing what it wants, but it knows it wants to be something different, the next step. And then we get it, engine regulations, the same thing. Chassis regulations, the same thing.
It's always worth remembering that when Pirelli did come in, that was the first ever ground-up control tyre F1 had. There'd been single suppliers before, but obviously when Bridgestone took that over, that was an ongoing programme. So it was tyre war technology going into it, and other times when it was Goodyear, that was still stuff they developed against, say, Pirelli or whoever. So actually, it's always worth remembering that that's the first time it's ground up where you're actually saying, actually, what do we want these tyres to do? And as the following 15 odd years have told us, it's very, very, very difficult because everything's moving. It's moving targets. Teams will adapt and teams will find ways to optimise, which will go against quite often what you want to try and achieve.
Well, briefly going off topic, I attended an event at Pirelli's, was it the Turkish factory in late 2010, once they had the deal. And once we'd had Canada, and there was all this talk about, oh, Bernie wants high degradation tyres. One of the big Pirelli bosses, I think you might still be there now, did a press conference and he got asked, are you going to make these like tyres that fall apart? And he said, absolutely not. We don't come in to make a product that's, looks, makes our road car products look bad. And he went, our tyres will be robust, they'll be strong, blah, blah, blah. And then obviously that didn't happen at the start of the year. And I always wondered, was it because they were asked to make high degradation tyres, or was it because that's all they could produce in time for the start of 2011?
I know they did do some things technically to try and do that. There's some things you can put into it, but it wasn't that. It wasn't very easy to do, and they did have problems because initially, if you remember, we drifted well beyond this particular race, but early on they had loads of marbles, didn't they? Remember driving? Paul di Resta getting very angry about getting hit in the sort of knuckles.
On some tracks you had like train tracks, didn't you?
Yeah. So they were sort of falling apart in the literal sense there. So it's actually a really interesting trajectory because there's lots of forks in the road there that have taken us to where we are now, and a lot of those sort of foundational assumptions about what you do with what your tyre objectives, etc. There'll come a time, because it always happens, when Pirelli's no longer the control supplier, and that's a chance to actually think, well, what have we learned from all of this, and can we reframe what we want to deliver and achieve in terms of our controlled tyre supplier? But
they won't.
No. Well, that's my simple answer is no.
No, well, you're right, and that's partly because the tyres are seen as the fix-all for everything, and they are just not. There's all sorts of problems, but the tyres are really easy to blame because everybody's got the same tyres. So if you complain about the tyres, you're not irritating partners or anything. So even in the Bridgestone one-make era, there were complaints. They weren't shouted about as much, but drivers would complain about the mythical dodgy set of tyres and all these things all going on.
Yeah, so let's get back to the Bridgestone era then, and we'll talk about qualifying in Turkey. Vettel looked very happy with that new chassis, setting the pace in Q1 and Q2, but he then complained of a brake problem in Q3, so he's only third on the grid, while teammate Webber once again took pole. The McLarens of Hamilton and Button were second and fourth. The Mercedes of Schumacher and Rosberg were fifth and sixth, and Kubica's Renault was seventh. So where are the Ferraris? Felipe Massa was eighth, while Fernando Alonso fell in Q2 and lined up 12th on the grid. Things didn't get that much better for them in the race, with Massa and Alonso finishing 7th and 8th, which prompted Alonso to declare that Red Bull and McLaren were very far away and that Ferrari was at Renault's level. Ferrari team boss Stefano Domenicali, I don't know what he's up to now, said that it was failing to keep up with the development rate of the top teams, and he said he needed to understand why our aero department didn't bring the things that we were supposed to bring. He said he wanted to see a reaction, not depression. John, obviously Alonso goes on to fight for this championship to the very end. At this point of the season, though, did it feel like Ferrari were getting left behind?
Yeah, but you have to remember this wasn't a traditional season of car development in terms of you bring a new front wing with more downforce, rear wing with downforce elements. It was a really innovative season of ideas. We'd come out of the double diffuser of the Brawn era, which everyone had adopted. And then going into the 2010 season, everyone thought this was a key area of exploitation. So Ferrari they've got an angled engine and gearbox to maximise the air at the back, and thought this was the key. We'll get tons of downforce here. It's brilliant. But at the same time, Red Bull, as everyone has spotted in pre-season testing, has started messing around with blown diffusers, really critical. And McLaren, obviously F-duct, blown rear wings, all those elements. So there were three separate kind of technology wars going on, and it quickly became clear that unless you were across all three of them, you weren't going to be successful. And Ferrari, gone down the blown diffuser route, then needed to get on with its blown rear wing, F-duct, and the blown diffuser. So it's just a case of when it could get these on the car, and once it did, the performance would come. And that's basically the story of their season. So at this stage, I think they'd started bringing the blown rear wing, which has been the first step to get there. But blown diffuser is obviously going to take a bit longer to come on board. So I think it was they were behind development, but it wasn't just that they hadn't brought aggressive upgrades. It was about fundamental changes to a car, which you couldn't introduce in a rush.
And also starting to respond to what Red Bull were doing, which was just accelerating development rates, rushing in parts, raising the standards. Obviously, there were lots of little mini tech controversies with the Red Bull in the first part of the season as well, on various bits and pieces, because Red Bull was setting new standards and sort of McLaren was hanging in there, but Ferrari was probably exposed more, although they did respond quite well in season.
And they were still having to adapt to life without being able to test at Fiorano whenever they wanted as well. Going back and doing the research for this, around this time, like before and after every race, there was like a status update of which team. Like Team X says they're not going to do an F-duct yet, or Team Y says they're going to try one in practice, and driver A doesn't like F-duct and doesn't want to use it, and this one's with a hat. We got a lot of content out of that back then as an industry. But we're going to get into the race now, and we go straight to the reason that we're all here. The first 2/3 of the race were all about McLaren and Red Bull. Webber led the opening stint from Hamilton, Vettel and Button, but Vettel got ahead of Hamilton when Lewis had a slow pit stop. Webber then had Vettel and the two McLarens right on his tail for the next 24 laps, and he couldn't try to pull away from them as he was being told by the pit wall to manage his fuel. He asked if Vettel was saving fuel as well, but as Vettel had been running behind other cars for the whole race, he hadn't burned as much as Webber had. And Red Bull couldn't get Vettel to back off from behind Webber, as the McLarens were right there behind them, and they were quick on the straights with the F-duct they'd pioneered in this season. On lap 40, Vettel got a run on Webber down the back straight, got alongside, and then just before the braking zone, the Red Bull drivers committed the cardinal sin and collided. This high-speed contact put Vettel out on the spot. His spinning car narrowly avoids Webber, who's running through the runoff as well. I've always wondered if Vettel could see Webber coming and kind of went, I'll just go this way and see if I can wipe him out as well. But Webber was able to continue, had to pit for repairs, so the race was handed to the McLaren drivers who'd been sat just behind and got to see all of this. Ed, there's loads of fallout to do here. We're going to go through it in very granular, typical Bring Back V10s style. But first, let's just analyse the collision. What do you think happened here, and was one driver more at fault than the other?
Yeah, obviously it was circumstances played a big part in it, because I think Vettel was the quicker driver that weekend. You mentioned he had some braking problems. I think he had like wheel lift problems in Q3 as well.
He had a broken roll bar.
Yes,
the team found afterwards. Okay. So having made this big thing about new car and it's all perfect, all sorted, he then had a mechanical problem, which I think that maybe contributed. Having seen Webber win those two races, you then lose out on pole position with your new chassis. You think, maybe something's going on here. So it may have fed into the race.
Exactly. So it creates that situation where the cars are the wrong way round, and because Red Bull didn't have the advantage it had, say, at Barcelona, where it was just far and away quicker. Yeah. Here it was a bit quicker, but McLaren was also then stronger relatively in the race compared to qualifying. So, yes, I mean, in terms of what went on, I think it's very clear if you watch the footage of the incident. Vettel's coming. Webber leaves him enough space. There's a point where Webber moves left a little bit, but he stops. And then Vettel does this thing that he did have in him, where he's trying to move back across when there's a car there. And it's pretty pronounced how much he moves over. So just purely in terms of the mechanics and the physics of the accident, you could argue Webber against his teammate shouldn't have defended as much or whatever. But if Vettel doesn't make that misjudgment, that doesn't happen. And I think that's a pretty uncontroversial reading of the pure mechanics of the incident on track. It starts to get complicated when all the other stuff's thrown in.
So, what did everyone say about it then? Vettel said, "It was clear I was on the inside. I was ahead. I'm just going to focus on the braking point." Webber...
He wasn't ahead, was he? 'Cause if he's ahead, he wouldn't have hit him. Yeah. He'd have pulled across the front of him.
Webber said, "We were side by side, and then it looks like Vettel turned pretty quickly to the right and we made contact." And Mark added that he felt reasonably comfortable with his role in what happened. He said he stayed tight to Vettel to keep him on the dirty side of the track for the braking zone, as he didn't want to give up the lead. And he said that while it might have felt to Vettel like Webber had driven into him, Webber was pretty confident that Vettel was the one who drifted across. And as you've said there, Ed, I think the TV pictures, which are nicely head on, which is always helpful, I think back that up.
F1 did a really good video of all the angles, so if anyone wants to watch along while listening, it's a good way because you see all the onboards, all the externals, and you can see all those relative movements.
Yes. Team boss Christian Horner said that the drivers were always asked to give each other room in battle, but in this situation, neither driver did that, which handed a 1-2 to McLaren. He said both played hardball, we saw the result, and that the drivers had to learn from it and make sure it didn't happen again. John, I'm still deliberately holding back the moment where this properly blows up. We'll get to that in a moment. Looking simply at how the drivers and team boss Christian Horner reacted to it, at this stage, did it just feel like that classic unfortunate collision between teammates that you probably could, at this point, just sort it out afterwards if you were Horner?
I think for a second, Christian thought I can sort this out afterwards, because you can get collisions and things happen, and drivers you pull the drivers into the office afterwards, you get it cleared up, and you present to the public a unified front. But from what I understand, the second Vettel walked out the car and did his twiddling of the twiddling of things, you weren't going to keep that under wraps. And then you've put it against the backdrop of the factions within the team Team Vettel v Team Webber, all those perceptions, Vettel feeling that everything was working against him, that he should naturally be ahead, for example. So against all that whole backdrop, it all exploded at that point, I think. So I think the second Vettel blew it into the public with his sign of this wasn't straightforward, you could no longer present a unified front. I think the thing was marching rapidly forwards at that point.
And then it got quite a big assist to make sure that it got out of hand. Enter Red Bull advisor Helmut Marko. He spoke to the media, including our very own Ed Straw, who can be seen in the TV footage of a paddock media scrum, where Marko said Vettel was already ahead, at least 2 metres ahead, and there was a corner to the left, so he had to go for the line. He cannot brake on the dirt. This obviously sounded a lot like Marko was blaming Webber, and when that was picked up on in the interview he's giving, I think, is it Will Buxton asking the initial questions for TV? Marko was asked if that meant he thought it was Webber's fault. Go and find this interview. It's well worth a look, because he pauses, and I think he thinks, in that moment, he goes, there's that brief moment where he goes, have I said too much? Should I rail back on it? He basically decides not to rail back on it, and he just finishes by going, unnecessary, the whole situation. Webber wrote in his book that after he returned from the post-race press conference, because he finished third, he thought he'd done a good job of not escalating the situation before he'd had a chance to talk to anyone from the team. So he doesn't really know what's going on, but you can find this transcript online. Mark does quite a good job of trying. He doesn't know what the party line is yet, but he's trying to guess where it is and trying to follow it. He said that when he got back, he couldn't believe what I was walking into. He said that Horner seemed to be managing things well enough and was doing a good job of being diplomatic, but Marko was blaming Webber, and Webber felt Horner seemed to perform a 180-degree turn to end up agreeing with Marko. Webber said he was also put out by the TV footage during the race that showed Vettel going to the Red Bull pit wall and being hugged by the team, with Mark saying, I began having serious doubts as to who was really pulling the strings at Red Bull Racing. Adrian Newey wrote about this in his book as well. He said Marko's comments caused near anarchy for Red Bull and left Newey and Horner trying to manage the damage behind the scenes as the situation spiralled out of control in public. So, Ed, as I mentioned, you're in that scrum. You're stood behind Marco. You're looking at him very sternly, I would say. What do you make of his role in all of this? Was it him that really caused the problem here?
Yeah, he certainly did. And unusually for Helmut Marko, I think he was aware of the risk of doing that, because my memory of how that all happened is there were a few of us meandering around and we spotted Marko, and he'd actually unusually refused to talk. But then Will Buxton was there with the camera, and it's much, much harder if there's a TV crew there with a camera. So Will stopped him, and then a few of us sort of joined the scrum. So I think Marko genuinely was trying not to speak to anyone because he knew that if he spoke to someone, what happened would happen. So there was a little, unusually for him, there was the thing in the back of his mind that he didn't want to do it. But yeah, Will had got in his way. And then, of course, once he'd started, there's some people like that who the only way to stop them saying the things they shouldn't is to not let them speak.
Yeah.
Most can just kind of get through it and not say what they shouldn't say. But there are some who just can't do that. And Helmut Marko, he was trying to be slightly careful, but he just wasn't. And that really did fan the flames. And ultimately, it underlines the whole strangeness of the situation, because what had happened on track hadn't been handled and managed well, because there was misunderstanding about what was going to happen, and messages weren't passed on to Webber that should have been, but also we were in the team orders ban era and all these things going on. So you've got all of that happening. So first up, it's not been managed well. And then secondly, you've got this whole scenario with Marko, who ultimately had what was described to me by somebody in the thick of that situation as quite a paternal attitude to Vettel. And that always helped me understand it a lot more, because it was more than just, oh, Vettel's my driver or whatever. It's like that there's a close relationship there. So you weren't kind of dealing in automatically rational arguments. And so that's what they're trying to deal with. And so you've got one driver who's furious and is being perhaps enabled in his fury because Helmut Marko's not doing the sort of Ross Brawn at Jerez 97 thing and saying, maybe have another look at the incident, just have a check, see what you think. So he's just got one senior person there. So that kind of lets Vettel continue to be furious. You've got the other driver who's annoyed already because it's happened. But probably Webber's quite happy initially because he's thought, well, I've not won the race, but I've gained more points than I would have done, and I've got the moral high ground. And then he discovers the moral high ground is being stolen from him. So he's like, what's going on here? And you've got Horner. So you've got all of this mess going on. And it does come down to that Marko-Vettel relationship. And it was always going to be a thing, and it didn't purely blow up because of that interview. But if Will with the camera hadn't been there, and then obviously that cornered Marko and allowed him to really say it, that certainly wouldn't have added the accelerant that did. So that did change the whole thing, and it was just, it couldn't be controlled, and it was just this sort of became this runaway train. It became more and more and more and more of a thing.
One thing there seems to be unity on from everyone involved in this chaotic situation, looking back years later, is that Red Bull definitely handled it badly in public. Newey admitted that in his book. Webber felt that no one really knew how to handle a scenario that had effectively played out in front of a global TV audience, which perhaps explains why the story just becomes a runaway train in the days following the race. Webber wrote a column for The Telegraph in the UK and appeared in an official Red Bull video talking about it. Red Bull released a Q&A with Horner, and in that Q&A and in a subsequent BBC interview, Horner tried to repair the damage that had been caused by Marko. Now, he said in a Red Bull Q&A that Marko now agreed it was a racing incident after looking at all the facts that weren't available immediately after the race. And to the BBC, he said it was a mistake for any blame to have been put specifically on Webber. Horner added, the problem is, in the heat of the moment, immediately after an event, a couple of opinions were made without sight of all the facts, and that's subsequently been dealt with. It's wrong for us as a team to apportion blame. What I found interesting, Horner talked about this in a lockdown interview he did on YouTube with David Coulthard in 2020, where Horner admitted, he said, at the time, I remember feeling that Mark hadn't allowed Sebastian enough space, but he went on to say that Webber squeezed him, but not unfairly, and that Vettel was a bit too greedy with how much track he wanted. The one person who didn't say much in the days after the incident was Vettel, but he eventually gave an interview to the BBC as well, where he said he was the leading car and usually the leader dictates where to go. He accepted that he tried to come slowly back to the right, but he said he did that because he had already passed Webber. John, how do you think Red Bull handled the fallout in the gap that we had between Turkey and the next race in Canada? As I've outlined there, it felt like every day there was a new piece of material, whether it's turning up in third-party media or Red Bull releasing more stuff. I'm obliged at this point to mention what I think is the worst staged photo of all time that we ran in Autosport Mag, where they basically got them together in the factory and got them both to like shrug together.
Red Bull shoving buddy. I remember when that arrived when we were in the office and we just found it hilarious.
Yeah, we put it in a magazine. It's one of the pictures from that era that is not still on Red Bull content pool. But I'll dig it out, like a scan of it or something, and I'll have to put it on social media because I just thought this shows that they're trying too hard and they're digging themselves too big a hole. But yeah, what was it like trying to keep up with what at this point was just, as I said, I think I described it earlier, a runaway train?
Yeah, but you've got two parallel paths being plotted here. You've got the public path of what the image they want to portray to us as the media at the time. You know, it's very early social media, so they weren't all over TikTok and YouTube and
no, you still needed
Twitter,
the media.
So you still needed to use the media. And I think it was fairly obvious. I mean, we would have loved the war to continue and battleground and them to hate each other and massive fallout. But inevitably, that was never going to happen. They were going to try to manage it as much as they could. It's always disappointing when we get these big potential conflicts and clashes and all this sort of thing are the lifeblood of Formula One, and you want them to run and run and run because it's better soap opera. So if you've got the pair of them smiling and laughing and doing these photo things, it's not great. So, but I think it's inevitable. They're not going to put statements out and say things in public. They would keep that for post Multi 21, I think. So, but then also there was what was going on in the factory because Christian had to now manage a situation where the captain of Team Vettel, Helmut Marko, had kind of made pretty clear where he was at. And then he was also trying to manage things between Seb and Mark. So there were two aspects here. He had them in the factory, chatted them together. Mark had let rip on a few things that he didn't feel the support. And I heard there was quite an interesting story about Christian was aware of Mark now feeling this quite open and said, right, well, the best way to solve this is to get Mark and Marko together and we'll sort it out. So called them into their office and basically said to Mark, right, you've told me some things now about you don't feel you're getting the support, you don't feel you're getting the backing, you feel that Marko is very one-sided. Tell him to your face. And I'm told Mark did tell him. Brilliant. So it went off and on, you don't support me, you criticise me, there's this, there's that, blah, 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 went on and on. And it all blew out into the public. I think Marko was quite taken aback by this, quite surprised that this had been perceived the way it was. And I'm told at the end of the meeting, then Marko says, we'll try and move things on. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear or not, but I can say it and you can bleep it out if not. And then Marko said, and then soon we go to Valencia too, and you're always shit there. Which kind of then blew into Mark. Said, well, this is exactly what I'm on about. You always undermine me and always criticise me. So it kind of broke the ice a little bit. And I think it's sometimes the informal moments can act as healing moments rather than trying to overmanage it.
Yeah.
And I think Christian also felt that this had blown up massively. And he took Seb and Mark down to Great Ormond Street to go and see the kids and said to them, look, you think what's going on after Turkey 2010 is the centre of the universe. You've got the weight of the world on your shoulders. It's the biggest thing. Put them in an environment where they realise, put it into context, go and see these kids, speak to their families, understand, what a small, insignificant thing F1 can be at times. And I think he did quite a good job in diffusing the situation and keeping it under control, at least until Multi 21.
It's such a good example, though, of how it is important that teams have a united front on it, because if Marko hadn't said things publicly, it would have been quite easy to say, because you can reach the thing Gary Anderson always says, is if you have the teammates colliding, there's a point where, unless it's just so completely egregiously one individual's fault, you can say, look, this can't happen. I don't care if it's 50-50, if it's 70-30. Your job is for this not to happen. Because you can say with Webber, well, look, Mark, you shouldn't squeeze to that degree. Because there was nothing wrong specifically with what Mark did. But in a team environment, you can argue, look, you need to leave a little bit more. And if you see him coming back, this needs to be avoided. You can take it and say, well, it's a 90-10 or whatever. And you can still say to both of them, look, that shouldn't happen. And, Mark Webber might not like it, but at least it's a more controlled thing. But as soon as you throw in all these other things that are going on, it gets out of control and it gets out into the public sphere as well. So you lose that control straight away, which is why it's so important to manage these things properly. And it's really hard. It's really, really difficult to get this right. But you don't need kind of one loose cannon individual there who will kind of shoot from the hip as Marco did. And in terms of that whole Vettel-Webber relationship, that neither was universally in the right or universally in the wrong. It was that's what you get. They're fighting for a world championship, and their characters will play a part. They're just one individual. We'll all have our own individual views of things going on, and it might seem different from the outside. But as soon as it's all out there in public as well, it becomes really, really hard to keep a lid on it. And the lid was never properly, fully put on that whole thing for the whole time, particularly in 2010. And as I say, you can draw a straight line from that to Multi 21. So yeah, you cannot manage it if there's not a relatively united front put up, and that's where it failed from a PR perspective, shall we say.
Well, I think managing drivers fighting for world championships is probably the most difficult challenge any team boss faces if they're both going for it. If you look at the Mercedes, the biggest crisis points between Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton were post-collisions, and how Toto was able to deal with it and the lengths he had to go to keep a lid on it. His concerns, some periods when Valtteri was looking very competitive and races were playing out, and some orders from the pit wall not necessarily being listened to in the fight for wins, and the fear of escalation about these things going. Because you're talking about marginal differences between teammates deciding a world championship. Decisions made in the thousandth of a second that are impacting things. You can't preordain every single outcome. And teams are based, your development plan, upgrade plan, spending plan, everything gets laid out brilliantly and perfectly before a race. But split-second decision on circumstances you don't expect can blow the whole thing out of the water. And then you've got to try and manage it. And then you're trying to overanalyze tiny little decisions that.
And then you create papaya rules.
Yeah, and then everything spirals out of control. And also, I think we'll come on McLaren, sometimes decisions are made that people view as being deliberate when they aren't actually deliberate.
Yeah.
It's just the way circumstance plays out. I think it's always it's one of the fascinations of Formula One is dealing with these teammates. And I've no doubt Toto is going to have some headaches even this season with Antonelli and Russell. We've already got the first, not big crisis happening, but the first inklings that, things are shaping out a certain way. Is one driver going to feel the luck's going against him? And then you start feeding it into you that is there something wider going on? It's always fascinating.
And all complicated in communication by the team orders ban.
At this point,
the problem is you can come up with all sorts of ways to impose team orders by code and that kind of thing. But drivers, quite rightly, will be selective about what they understand. And if there's any room for manoeuvre, they will, they will find ways to contest it. So the communication side of it, because it was clear they wanted those two drivers to swap positions, and the ideal thing to be would have been to say, right, Mark, let's head past. They couldn't specifically do that.
And he wouldn't have obeyed it.
Possibly not, but that then comes down to a thing you try and sort behind the scenes, because you ultimately, if you're the driver, most cases you should obey a team order, but at least you've got to be clear about it, because if you're not clear about it, then it leaves that room to manoeuvre, doesn't it? And whatever, because there was some talk about that I believe there should have been some kind of message given, which is why they didn't like the extent to which Webber defended. So it all comes back to that. It comes back to, what do you want them to do? Don't just hope it'll sort itself out. You want to control the situation. That's what F1 teams try and do. But as John's explained, those are really difficult and volatile situations to contain. The most important thing is to react well to it. And that's, again, where the Marco problem comes in, because he said what he said and just fanned the flames.
But if McLaren didn't have the F-duct and was so quick down the straight, then Red Bull could well have left the race to play out
Yeah,
Vettel had
maybe 20 seconds up
better
the road.
fuel, and there'll be much easier life. Yeah, I remember watching the very start of this race, those first laps with the 2 Red Bulls and 2 McLarens, thinking this is a powerhouse of a Grand Prix. You've got 4 top drivers gunning for it, really close victory, different strengths and weaknesses. And Red Bull had a fight on their hands that potentially hadn't anticipated. And with the McLaren F-duct advantage, it compromised what it could do later on. Because in F1, you're not in full control of everything. You can have all your plans all laid out perfectly, and another team's ready to scupper it. And this is the beautiful dynamic of Formula One, that just when you think everything's in your hand, someone can take it away from you.
Good example, before the collision, this race is also a good example of a race where on the surface, nothing's actually happened yet. Like, there wasn't loads of overtaking, but just, as you say, seeing those 4 cars absolutely going at it, knowing that the drivers are pushing really hard, knowing that they're burning too much fuel, that's going to cause a problem later on. Like, you couldn't take your eyes off it, even though up to this point there hadn't really been any overtaking.
And it's one of those ones where there's that imminent threat of rain that never quite manifests
That's true,
itself.
yeah. So while all of this was going on, all the fallout was being handled between Turkey and Canada. The timing's brilliant. This was also the time when Mark Webber signs a new deal with Red Bull for 2011. In the middle of all this, I think it's absolutely perfect time, which is why I've included it. Webber and Horner said the decision was easy and straightforward. Webber was happy to agree a 1-year extension, as it suited him to take things one season at a time at this stage of his career. In his book, Webber said that although there was a bad smell after Turkey, I wasn't about to write off my own chances by announcing to the team I was off to pastures new in 2011. I already felt things were going to be stacked against me, but they would have turned the tap off quick smart, and the momentum would have swung firmly in Seb's direction. So, Ed, was this actually good pragmatism from Webber? Don't give up this great situation you're in with the best car just because there's all this tension going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, he was absolutely right. And also longer term, it was just the right place to be, wasn't it? And he almost won that year's championship. So, yeah, there's nothing whatsoever wrong with doing that. What would he have achieved by flouncing off somewhere? So, completely pragmatic. It's the team to be at. You're working with Adrian Newey, Red Bull team in its first glory era, and early in it, there's still great peaks to come. So, yeah, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that decision.
Before we move away from Red Bull and focus on McLaren's dramas in this race, let's pick up on Webber's comments about feeling that things were going to be stacked against him. Webber said in his book that after his back-to-back wins in Spain and Monaco that came before this weekend, his manager, Flavio Briatore, had told him that situation wouldn't be allowed to continue, as Webber wasn't the chosen one at Red Bull. Webber felt that the Turkey situation had made it clear Marko was pulling the strings at Red Bull and that he had an agenda to make Vettel the centre of the team. He also wrote a letter to Red Bull owner Dietrich Mateschitz outlining his feelings on everything that had happened, and Webber said Horner went apoplectic when he found out about that. The letter is reproduced actually in full in Webber's book, so I'm going to do a little bonus thing for the Race Members Club where we can have a read through of it together and kind of stop off along the way and share a few thoughts on it. Webber said that he and his management put Horner on the spot in private, asking him to abandon the pretense of even-handedness and just tell us exactly where I stood in the team. He said he wouldn't leak it to the outside world. He just wanted to be told once and for all if there was a pro-Vettel agenda within the team. And he said, we tried to make Christian understand that he was doing a great disservice to himself by allowing himself to be undermined by Marko. Webber said he was old enough and ugly enough to understand that Horner was put in a difficult position politically by trying to keep everyone happy, particularly Marko. But Mark added, all we wanted was to be told the truth, but he couldn't do that, and for me that was a sign of weakness. It was at this stage that I began losing respect for him. It must have been uncomfortable for him to be a frontline spokesperson for the team without enjoying any real power within the hierarchy. To offer some balance on this, Adrian Newey felt Webber let Marko's favouritism towards Vettel rile him, even though Horner and Newey were trying to keep things fair. Newey added that Webber and his camp started spending too much time worrying about Helmut and Sebastian, which Newey felt was understandable in many ways, but also potentially self-harming, because there's no point wasting energy on things you can't change. John, you've talked about what you've heard about what went on behind the scenes and Mark letting Helmut know exactly what he really thought of him. Do you think, though, Mark became too focused, perhaps even obsessed on the Marco factor within Red Bull?
Yeah, I think it becomes a negative force. If you obsess over the issues that you aren't in control of, if you start thinking that things are deliberately happening when they aren't necessarily deliberately happening, it's just the way things are rolling out, then you aren't concentrating on making yourself quicker. Every minute you spend worrying about things going against you is a minute you spend not concentrating on what you can make better or how you push on. And I think it's a trait, maybe it fed through a little bit to Oscar Piastri last season in terms of that post-Monza fallout with papaya rules and
who is his manager.
Exactly. You just start feeding into the negatives and it plays on your mind. And I think the greats can have these explosions and get them sorted out, but they don't let it linger, or they bring it up and get it out into public straight away. Just as Seb Vettel did. You look at Multi-21, for example, and came straight out afterwards and absolutely went public on what he felt and why he did it and all this sort of thing. You don't let these little things fester. And I think Christian was trying to balance out a lot. It was very complicated, even throughout the entire Horner Red Bull period. It's a very complicated setup with Dietrich Mateschitz and Helmut Marko being that important line into Red Bull, so had a lot of power that Christian wasn't necessarily under full control, and there were things that Marko did he wasn't aware of, and Christian's trying to keep these two balanced things, not having always the full picture from Marko. So sometimes he would go direct to Dietrich, other times Marko would deal with it. Questions over contracts, there were questions about was there a clause somewhere in terms of agreements with Red Bull that Vettel was clear number one and had to be honoured, because Christian said there was never clarity about this in some respects. So I wonder if he was always onto a loser in some situations. By trying to please everybody, which is the job of a team boss, and trying to keep things equal, it then kind of fed into the paranoia that things weren't being equal. So I think you're in a scenario where you're never going to please both drivers, because whatever you do, if you treat them both equally, Vettel's going to get upset because he thinks he should rightfully be winning all the races, and if Mark wins is for reasons outside of my control. But then if Mark wins because he's generally done a better job, that then causes problems in the team. If Vettel wins, then the paranoia is that he's getting better treatment and this shouldn't be happening. So whatever the outcome is, you're always going to end up in trouble.
I think it certainly became too much of a focal point. I remember being told, I can't remember the exact timeline of this, whether it was around this time or a bit later, but I remember being told that on Webber's side, they'd start flagging up things where I think Vettel had gone to an appearance and not had the right team shoes on or something. So it became a little bit too much of a focal point, and that became a manifestation of not a driver just not just being a bit careless with shoes. It suddenly became why is he allowed to do that? That's clearly favouritism. It's like, well, so you've got to be really careful, and you can understand how that happens, particularly with someone with Mark Webber's psychology as well, and that's for the better as well, because Mark Webber really didn't have much behind him to get to F1. It's a miracle he got to Formula One and had the career he did. He did that on ability because he didn't have the backing but behind him. So you can't separate the kind of negative effects from that from the positive. So he is someone who I think benefited sometimes in kind of having enemies to fight as well. And there was certainly a certain amount of legitimacy to the concern there. But I think it also, the role got built as well, which sometimes will have helped him, and maybe sometimes it went against him and just became too much of a thing. Because
it was a mindset that got him into a top seat,
yeah,
and it could have won him the World Championships. You can't say it was the wrong scenario. There were tiny circumstances at the end of that season, the incident in Korea, for example, that turned things around massively. And I think he was someone who thrived on this sense of paranoia, the whole Aussie grit thing, like, knuckling in and being super strong and tough and not taking anything lying down, was what made him so strong, so brilliant.
That's what got him there.
What got him there. And if you say that was a mistake to have it when you were fighting for the championship, actually he wouldn't have been in the first place, wouldn't have been there in the first place if he hadn't had those qualities. So this sometimes you look at some of the greats, for example, that there are benefits to being a great in doubting yourself and not being super convinced of yourself, because it stops arrogance being there. And all these, complications of are champions better champions if they have absolute conviction that they are the very, very best? Or does that then lead to complacency, make you not deliver your best? So endless complications. So I think Webber's, this level of paranoia was both a strength and a weakness at the same time.
And we all have, everyone's got these strengths and weaknesses and areas. You know, you can relate this. I'm sure people will be able to relate this to situations they've been in and that kind of thing. It's not, often when we're talking about this, it's taken as some massive criticism, but it's just what you see happening. And all drivers have some point where things just break down, or there's a blind spot, or they go too far or whatever. But it's a question of, is it more positive than negative? And in Webber's case, it was certainly more positive than negative, because if he didn't have that, he probably wouldn't be in that Red Bull in the first place. He probably wouldn't have even started a few Grand Prix with Minardi, let alone built that into the career he did have.
Let's finish then with how the rest of this race played out after the Red Bulls had eliminated themselves from contention. The McLarens of Hamilton and Button were now running 1-2, and 9 laps after the Red Bulls had clashed, another set of teammates were side by side on the run to the final hairpin, with Button attacking Hamilton on the outside. Button held on around the outside to briefly take the lead for the final 2 corners of the lap, but Hamilton got a run on him down to the first corner and sent it back down the inside, where they do briefly rub wheels, with Lewis coming back out on top. Button then backed off as he was told his fuel situation was critical for getting to the end of the race, so Hamilton got to bring it home to take his first win of the season. Ed, as we'll cover in a moment, there was more fallout to come from this as well, kind of in the shadow of what's going on with Red Bull. But looking at the battle itself, the wheel-to-wheel action that we had for a few corners, was this an example to the Red Bull drivers of how it could be done?
Yeah, it was great, wasn't it? They could easily have had a collision, proper collision at the first corner when they were battling, but they didn't, because even though, Button was happy to try it on, he also knew he didn't want to cause a crash, and Hamilton obviously wants to. So yeah, it's a good exhibition of how this can be done. It's perhaps not such a good exhibition of how you manage that and communicate things, but there's nothing wrong with anything they did on track in terms of the wheel-to-wheel stuff.
Now, if you watch back the footage of the drivers before they go into the podium, you might notice that Hamilton seems a bit off. Paddy Lowe's with the drivers, as he's going to be the one taking the trophy for McLaren. You see him grab Lewis and have a word in his ear. Then just before the drivers are called out onto the podium, you see Button and Hamilton are deep in conversation before they walk out in front of everybody. So let's explain what that was all about then. The picture became clearer in the days after the race, when more McLaren team radio was released via the F1 website. We were saying before recording, weren't we, how different the world was in 2010, that team radio could come out days later and only through official channels. This would have been out on social media as it happened, pretty much. But anyway, in that radio, we heard Hamilton be told to save fuel, and he was told that both cars were going to be doing the same. Hamilton questioned it, asking if Button was going to pass him if he backed off, and he was told that Button wouldn't attack. So when Button did attack, Hamilton was straight on the radio again, asking what the hell is going on. Lewis kept his cards pretty close to his chest after the race, saying he'd been told to fuel save to a level that wasn't easy without going particularly slowly, and he made a vague reference to the communication from the pit wall not being particularly clear. Button said he had been told to save fuel, but added it's always difficult to know how much, and he said McLaren didn't give him a set lap time, he'd just been told to save a bit. John, was this just a bit of mismanagement from the McLaren pit wall, and were they lucky actually that after the mix-up the consequences weren't a lot worse?
Yeah, the consequences could have been 2 cars out, and then Webber would have won, which would have been a complete irony. And then would Webber have won the championship?
It would have changed things. It would have made this episode a lot longer, I think, as well. Yeah.
This episode's long enough.
So yeah, but I think this was a classic thing that happens in Formula One, of decisions are made on the hoof, because it's a motor race, you can't predict things happening, and communication from the pit wall may feel that it's very crystal clear in terms of what the instructions are, but the drivers aren't quite aware of what's happening. And from Lewis's perspective, his understanding was that the instruction was to both save fuel, Button doesn't attack, so he's got that clear instruction. Then Button attacks him, therefore he must have disobeyed team orders. This is an outrage. Yeah. So you're seeing And I think it's a phenomenon known as Hanlon's razor, where you put malice towards deliberate mistakes. So there was a mistake from the pit wall in not making things crystal clear to both drivers about the situation. But from Lewis's perspective, you can understand why he felt like this afterwards. But these are flashpoints that happen all the time. So I think it must be very difficult when you're a driver. You can only got your perception of what you see from the race, your impression from the pit wall. Then when you see your teammate attack you or do something strange, you think, well, what's going on here? He must have tried to screw me over.
Yeah, you can understand it as well, because if you're slowing down, you want to know if your teammate's going to attack or not.
He asked a very clear question, as we've just heard. He got a clear answer, and then what he sees play out around him is different to that. It is a pretty straightforward one in terms of understanding why he was so perturbed by it.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously they should have managed it better, but Button will have known probably that Hamilton would have felt that he wasn't going to be attacked, and perhaps Button thought it would be within his armoury to think this will annoy him because they're racing drivers, they're competing, and that's why I don't have any problem with what either of them do or how either of them felt about it. It's just, could McLaren have handled it a bit better? Probably could have done.
Yeah, Button gave a clearer version of what went on when he released his book in 2017. He said that he didn't know Hamilton was being told to save fuel, and that before the podium, Hamilton outright asked him if he had disobeyed team orders when he took the lead, and Button said that he hadn't because he was never told he couldn't pass Lewis. Button said that made Hamilton think McLaren were taking sides against Lewis, and Jensen called the whole misunderstanding a bit weird and slightly unnecessary. He felt it showed that all was not well behind the smiles at McLaren. But that reaction from Hamilton and the release of the radio traffic by F1 probably explains what happened next. As then, we've already talked about how Red Bull's come out and gone, we've got to release all this content to tidy everything up. McLaren's Martin Whitmarsh had to come out and explain what had gone on from the team's perspective. Whitmarsh said the response Hamilton got from his engineer Phil Prue that Button wouldn't try to pass him was an instinctive and immediate response and was only the engineer's opinion, which Whitmarsh said turned out to be wrong. Ed, does that sound a bit like McLaren are throwing Lewis's engineer under the bus there?
A little bit, yeah, because the engineer wouldn't give just a random opinion.
That's not how engineers operate, is it?
What I suspect probably happened is, because everybody always talks about having certain understandings and rules and all these kind of things. So perhaps he may have legitimately felt, we've talked about scenarios like this. If there's fuel saving going on.
Yeah, if you're in late race fuel saving and you're 1-2, the race is off.
Yeah, but that's the trouble is then accessing emphatically what were the exact frame of reference in which these things are happening. I'm not sure. So I think that, combined with the fact there's just this general unnervedness about team orders because of the ban, a whole position thing's less of a problem than a let someone pass. I mean, obviously this all kicked off at Hockenheim later in the year, but it just shows how if you leave any uncertainty, any cracks, that you have problems. So yeah, I imagine there was a reason that he thought there wouldn't be a pass made, but they'd not told that it was not clear. You've just got to say to both drivers what's going to go on and make sure, because it's only 2 lines of communication, so it should be fairly easy to do. But what they've tried to do there is, because the trouble is, you've got the evidence of the engineer telling the driver that. So what else actually can you say? Because you probably throw more people under a bus saying, that wasn't meant to happen, but we hadn't told him. Because then you get, why did he say that then?
Yeah, I did wonder if there's another version of this, which is, actually, it's Jensen's engineer's fault for not saying whole position.
Exactly, yeah. So I would hope that there was a conversation before this was said publicly about what they were going to say and why. And sometimes it's just, look, we know it's not quite right, but this will help us calm it. Take one for the team.
Right.
I would imagine that probably happened just in terms of doing, unless there was just unless he genuinely just did say, he's definitely not going to pass you, groundlessly, which would be an odd thing to do.
It often falls down to the phrases used and then the interpretation of what the question is. Because you can ask, will he overtake me, as in based on his fuel trajectory and the pace he's on, is he due therefore to overtake me? And the answer is no. But then, will he overtake me
if I slow down?
Question is there any team orders or anything in play? And then the answer is no. You think, there's no team orders, this is all fine. So, but in races, you haven't got time to sit down. You're not trying to sort out a massive contract where you're debating 15 terms and going backwards and forwards between lawyers on interpretations of what will means and what does overtake me mean, and define it and come down and then sign the form. You're in a fight for the race lead. It's a conversation. You can think you've given the perfect answer at the time for an innocuous question. I'm sure there are loads of these conversations happen all the time based on interpretations that aren't actually what you were asked, but it never flares up into a moment. It's when these little events happen, a question gets asked, interpreted one way, answers interpreted a different way, and it creates these flashpoints.
I think the lesson is always to the driver, don't let them. Just take it into your own hands, and you fuel save a bit, but just don't do it so much that you put yourself in harm's way. And often that's the simplest thing to do. Just take it off the table.
Well, and remember also the team orders situation.
Yeah.
So you couldn't have an emphatic. Teams were a bit kind of tied up in terms of what they could and couldn't tell drivers.
So the code here was probably, if we tell them both to fuel save, they'll know what that means. The button's going, well, they've not given me a lap time, so I'll just fuel save this much.
Exactly.
I've overtaken him.
The thing is, the rules make them be ambiguous.
Yeah.
But anyone who is presented with ambiguity will think, well, that's a bit ambiguous, isn't it? I've got plausible deniability here. Because they're racing drivers and they want to win. That's the thing that, while it's not a problem that this happens, because they're competitive people and your job is to win the race or overtake whoever's ahead or whatever. That's what you've got to do. This is one of the joys of it. It's also one of the reasons why the team orders ban was a complete nonsense and unworkable and did eventually break down. But that's another story.
Well, look at the mess at Hockenheim.
Exactly. We'll do Hockenheim 2010 one day, and that's where we'll get into all of that. So we'll leave Turkey 2010 there. We've gone on long enough, but thanks to John and Ed, it's always fun, as I said at the start, when we've got the guys who are actually there on the ground. It's why there's so much more to say when we've got first-hand experiences and a bit of ferry chat at the start as well.
Can you thank producer Johnny for carrying our groceries as well, because that was very important.
Yeah, thanks for buying everybody lunch, Johnny, or at least carrying it home. So thank you as well to everybody listening or watching, and let us know if you'd like more stories from after the V10 era ended in 2005. I always find these episodes are a lot of fun to put together. There's plenty of stuff going on. Everything, the way F1 was covered had changed by this point, so there's even more stuff to dig into. And frankly, the V8 era itself is ages ago now, so I feel like we've got plenty of material we can get into, and it's still a long way back into the past.